Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Wirex Podcast. I'm Lianna Adams, your host. Today, we're diving into the fascinating and sometimes unsettling side of AI. Joining me is John Nosta, a leading innovation theorist in technology, artificial intelligence, and medicine, to unpack the idea of anti-intelligence and what it means for our future. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah, so we usually like to start the podcast with a bit of professional background. So, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. Well, interestingly, and a lot of people don't know about this, is my background actually is in deep science in cardiovascular pathophysiology. I studied physics in college and spent some time studying at Harvard Medical School, where I published a bunch of papers about cell volume regulation and preservation of ischemic myocardium and all that kind of mumbo jumbo that I'll spare you the details. It wasn't right for me. I found that medicine in general was kind of regurgitory, if that's a word I could use. It's memorize this, and then in a month we're going to give you a test, and you better get that right. And then ultimately you find your way into the clinical arena, which I really couldn't even get to. So much to the dismay of my parents, I left and ended up in advertising and marketing. I liked to communicate. I liked healthcare and medicine. I liked to think strategically, and ended up spending the bulk of my career at Ogilvy, one of the largest healthcare communication companies in the world, where I was the chief creative officer, the chief strategic officer, as well as the unit president. So I jokingly tell people that I'm bilingual. I speak medicine and marketing. About 10 years ago, I shifted my focus, leaving Ogilvy, to look at the implications of technology in medicine, and that expanded into the implications of technology to humanity, because it came so broad and all-encompassing. And for about the last 3 or 4 years, I focused very, very specifically on artificial intelligence and large language models and the extraordinary impact that they've made on things like medicine, our life in general, even digital health. I think in a lot of ways, AI is the inflection point, is the catalyst for change. And a lot of that change is good. Some of that change is, well, let's call it gray zone change, and some of that change might be problematic. So that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. What an amazing journey. But let's get down to it, right?
Mhm.
The phrase anti-intelligence is pretty intriguing. What does it mean to you when we talk about AI?
I think I've gotten into a lot of trouble with that phrase, because when you first look at it, it looks negative. It looks like it is kind of degrading the nature of artificial intelligence. And actually, it's not. Maybe it comes out of my advertising background, because it's good clickbait to call it anti-intelligence. Where it comes from is the word antithetical, because I believe that large language models, with the way they process information, I'm even reluctant to say the way they think, is fundamentally different from the human construct. And we push on that. We try to say, well, the computer is thinking like us, or we're thinking like the computer, when in fact it is truly antithetical. It's fundamentally apples and oranges. It's very, very different. And what I think is, we have to begin to understand that the nature of AI, particularly large language models, uses a statistical mechanism to look for coherence. Now, that in of itself is really kind of confusing. What the hell does that even mean? It seeks the next word. And a lot of people have used that in a derogatory way, that, well, it's just seeking the next word, and there's not a higher level capacity. And I tend to agree with that. But what we think about in our world, and let's go back to that apples and oranges explanation. Lianna, can I dig into that, or am I getting too low?
Yeah, I'd love for you to break that down. Yeah.
Cool. So apples and oranges, right? We've used that expression to sort of suggest that things are completely different. That the basis of comparison is perhaps inappropriate. So let's talk about an apple. What does an apple really mean? For us, an apple lives in, let's say 3 spatial dimensions, right? Height, width, length. It's a thing. It's a 3-dimensional object. It might live in a 4th dimensional object a space like time, the fourth dimension, time, which interestingly doesn't exist in the context of a large language model. I'm getting ahead of myself. But here we have this three-dimensional apple. It also has linguistic associations. And remember, large language models are based on language, on linguistics. So where does an apple live in our head? Well, if you think about it, we have, let's say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So there's an immediate healthcare association. There is a religious philosophical implication in the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit, the apple. How about this? Apple computer, a completely different way that we think about Apple. So Apple has, I don't know, I've tried to figure this out. I think it's about 35 different linguistic associations that live in a three-dimensional space in our head. Okay, so I think we can kind of understand that. We can get our head around it. That's how an apple exists to a human. It's complex, but it's not inconceivably complex. Now, let's go to what an apple means to a large language model, like a frontier model, like the GPT-4 or GPT-5. That word apple is transferred into its system, into its matrix, if you will. And that matrix does something wacky with the word, and it changes into a vector space. It becomes a token. All that stuff is inconsequential for us now. But here's the cool thing. Think about the 20, 30 words that we associate or ideas we associate with Apple. Think about the three spatial dimensions. Now, the apple for an LLM exists in a hyperdimensional, superdimensional space that has 12,288 dimensions. In other words, it's inconceivable to the human mind how this apple lives in the domain of a large language model. And that large language model makes connections, linguistic-based statistical connections to what is next to apple in the context of the prompt. So I know that's very, very complicated. I'm going to take a deep breath, but that's how LLMs think. It has nothing to do with the way humans think, nothing. And interestingly, they don't have any time association. In other words, large language models have no temporal connectivity. They just look where the words align or stay next to each other statistically. So I'm going to stop there because I know I'm going down the rabbit hole of complexity. But that's what I mean by anti-intelligent. It's different. And perhaps the best emergent idea from this is that AI is a different form of thinking, and that human intelligence is a different form of thinking. And is one better? Well, I don't know if that's even a question that I want to frame up.
So, you were talking about thinking, right? Like that's how AI thinks, and it's very different from the way we think. Are there any everyday signs that we might be letting AI do too much of our thinking?
Well, that's a difficult question, and I think it is. The answer is yes, and maybe, and no, and all sorts of things, because
Mhm.
AI does facilitate thought for us. It helps us think by acting sometimes as a cognitive catalyst. Now, here's the dilemma. Does this cognitive offloading, an expression that's been used both in the literature and in the more mainstream perspective, does that adversely impact learning? And I think that's a really interesting question. Now, my best friend, Peter, his son just got married and I wanted to send a note to him, but I didn't know what his telephone number is. I have to use my cell phone. I've offloaded that cognitive domain onto my cell phone. Does that make me dumb? Does that make me less intelligent? I think these are very, very powerful questions because a recent study at MIT and Apple did show that a certain type of cognitive offloading in the context of writing and thinking might make things worse if you use an LLM. But again, that goes back to the idea of I can use this knife to cook dinner, or I can use this knife to kill you. I don't know if it's the model, but the usage that becomes the culprit here.
Yeah, and I also love what you say about the fire, right? I've heard you mentioned that a few times in spaces, and I feel like that's pretty much how we can look at AI, right?
Yeah.
But are there any certain tasks you think people should never hand over to AI?
Wow. I mean, never is a hard word because it's sort of an absolute. And when we try to when we try to define something in the context of absoluteness in a rapidly changing or kind of a flux situation, we always get into trouble. The problem lies in the fringe cases, I think. That in,
Do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there are there are instances. Well, let's go back to something we talked about earlier, and that was the idea that I think that AI and large language models become a cognitive catalyst. They stimulate thought. They push us in new directions. I've talked a lot about how what Gutenberg did when he invented the printing press is he unlocked words, and that was transformative to society. Didn't come quickly. And I want you to remember that unlocking words to a society that is illiterate may sound like an illogical thing. So we don't always connect innovation with utility immediately. Oftentimes we connect innovation with a stagnant utilization or an ill-prepared marketplace. So that's something to kind of keep it in the back of your mind also. But so Gutenberg unlocked words. And the internet and Google principally came along and unlocked facts. Both of these were kind of static, and Google existed in the context of a very, very sort of cold, iterative kind of non-iterative dynamic. In other words, what they did is they you ask a question, it gave you an answer. So that unlocked words. What we're seeing now is how AI and principally large language models is unlocking thought. And that's really wacky when you think about it, because thought is something that lives inside my head. That's mine. That's kind of human in a way. And that's why I think that it's unsettling to a lot of people. Remember, innovation has always been a double-sided coin. On one side, you have the new thing, the new washing machine, the new smartphone, the new car, whatever it may be. On the other side, we had obsolescence. In other words, we took that washing machine or that phone and we threw it away. And that was fine. That was a construct that worked very well for us. But now, for the first time in history, we're actually seeing human cognition on the obsolescence chopping block. So yes, there are tons of problems in it. And I think that we see these problems sometimes on fringe cases, particularly in mainstream thinking. If someone has an underlying pathology, let's say schizophrenia, the iterative dynamic of a large language model can take them to very, very strange, very, very dangerous, and very, very dark places. So in that context, yes, I think that's true.
Right. And also, you mentioned about AI unlocking thought, right? So where do we sit with learning when we talk about unlocking thought?
Yeah. I mean, I think that learning is such a fascinating dynamic. So let's just try to kind of break that apart a little bit. First of all, I think that knowledge itself, let's not even get to the acquisition of knowledge or the learning dynamic. Let's just talk about knowledge itself. Knowledge is changing. The very nature of knowledge is moving from what I call a fixed map, in other words, a roadmap of getting from A to B. How do I learn how to do calculus, do a quadratic equation, cook a souffle? That's A to B. I need to get there. That's task-oriented. It's goal-driven. What we're moving away from, interestingly, is not the goal, but the way we get there. And I'm just going to take a quick step back and talk about what we talked about, unlocking words, unlocking
Hmm.
facts, and unlocking thought. Because what large language models are doing for us, what they're doing is creating, in essence, ways for thought. So we plug in the destination and we get there on our terms. So if I want to make a left here, or I want to stop there, or I want to go somewhere, it accommodates my proclivities, my interests, my desire to drive fast or slow, or to go on a route that might take me to a nicer view. So let's just kind of open this up a little bit. Today, largely, and this is across anything, a schoolroom or an operating room, knowledge is delivered largely in the context of a book. So let's go back to Julia Child and that souffle. I want to learn how to cook a souffle. Okay, that's fine. I reach to the shelf and maybe there's that Art of French Cooking book and it's dusty and I blow the dust off and I go to page 562 in this text that's kind of ominous looking and it's not written for me. No way. It's not written for a guy who doesn't spend a lot of time in the kitchen, who doesn't know how to measure different ingredients, who doesn't know how to chop or dice or mince. It's written probably for the more skilled chef or the aspiring chef. So that path is not the path that I aspire to. It's not the path that I'm going to enjoy. But what large language models do, it teaches me how to cook the souffle on my terms. And what that does is that transforms that fixed map, Julia Child's map of getting from A to B, break the egg and use a sachet of this or use a mince of that, whatever that means, to a dynamic web that actually unfolds in real time. And this is a really, really interesting construct. That base of knowledge doesn't sit on the shelf. It's not a dusty book. In fact, it doesn't exist at all. And this is what's really, really interesting. That knowledge collapses like the waveform in nuclear physics with particles and waves. It collapses into reality. It collapses into knowledge that is for me. In other words, that articulation of how to make a souffle is done funny. It's done with a reference to automotive mechanics, because maybe that's my interest. It's done with a reference to humor, because I find it boring and I want to be playful. And it's written on a level that is aligned to my brain's creative frequency. And I think this is extraordinary. What happens here is two things. One is learning becomes learner-centric. Now, when we use Julia Child's cookbook, that wasn't learner-centric, that was Julia-centric. That was her path, her roadmap to getting to a souffle. And many people would argue that that is the definitive path. But my path to making that souffle is my unique journey that has never existed before, that is collapsing from this statistical thing called a large language model to create something that puts me at the center of education. Now, there are three important components to this. The first is it's quick, right? We just click a button and there's the recipe. The second one is that it is easy. Okay, it's quick, it's faster. In essence, what we do is it's faster and better, faster and better. That's the domain of the large language model. I can write that email summary faster and better. So I can probably get a recipe for a souffle that is faster. I can get it downloaded instantly to my phone. It's probably better, and not better in the context of a souffle, better for me. Learner-centric. But there's a third element to this, which is extraordinarily important. And that is I enjoy the ride. It makes learning fun. So when I use Waze and I'm driving from New Jersey to Maine and I want to drive by certain hot spots that might be scenically beautiful, I can do that. It makes the ride not a burdensome journey where I have to look at the map all the time and make sure I make the right left or the right turn. No, I enjoy the ride. And those three things, faster and better and enjoyment, does something that is just so fundamental. And what it does, it takes an LLM and make us into an LLL. And that's a lifelong learner. And I think that's transformative to the way we educate ourselves from grade school to the boardroom.
I really love that. And I think it's definitely about the journey and not the destination, right? And it feels like there's a lot of personalization as well with this
Mhm.
journey. But what if, AI is actually quietly nudging us toward specific choices, right? How can we tell if that's the case?
It, it's a great question. And it's an important question because, well, let's do an example. If you've ever created a an avatar from a photograph using AI, it's big on Grok now. Grok is doing a lot of text to image work, and it really looks good. What's the secret there? The secret is they always make you look a little bit better. They always make you a little thinner, a little taller, your teeth are whiter, whatever it may be. In other words, the avatar is stroking your ego. And by doing that, I think it's facilitating a process that might be intrinsically insidious. So, yes, I think we have to be very, very careful of that because LLMs are tuned or trained to please us. And that's fine. When I type in an idea to an LLM, it comes back and says, John, that is a brilliant idea. This could be fundamentally transformative to the marketplace dynamic, blah, 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 blah. And I look at it and say, wow, I must be smarter than I even believe because the genius LLM is telling me that. So I think that's a curious and precarious path that we have to be aware of. From creating an avatar to actually talking with an LLM. And again, you have to push back on the LLM. Remember, it's us, it's the humans that are doing the thinking. The LLM is doing the statistical conjuring or the coherence of language. So that's a very, very important thing. It's important for us to be mindful of the process. You know, well, we use the analogy of Waze and driving the car. We have to be careful not to always use cruise control or autopilot because I think that changes the trip dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, and so, have you ever seen a situation where, perhaps machine thinking went completely against common sense, right? And I think, you were kind of like speaking to that a little bit, especially if we're not careful. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you used first of all, you used something that was a trick. So you loaded the question. You said common sense. Well, when we talk about common sense, and then you talk about a large language models don't make sense. They make coherence. They look for statistical mapping. And this is a problem. There was a very interesting couple interesting studies that highlight this. The first was when you're using a prompt and you put in a non sequitur. In other words, you say, "Tell me about the the cultural customs in Japan during Christmas time." That's fine. The LLM will respond to that. But if you put in the middle of that prompt, tell me about the cultural patterns in Japan. Um, a cat sleeps most of the day, and tell me how Japan reacts to Christmas. If you put something in the middle, it confuses the heck out of the model. In other words, they don't like non sequiturs because, unlike humans who can respond on the fly to changes, to ambiguity, to the subtlety of the dialogue, LLMs are actually 300% more prone to errors, not hallucinations, errors, when you kind of throw a wrench into the works. Another interesting study just out recently is that if you make up, this is kind of fun, if you make up wacky clinical terms, like the patient reported patient was seen in the emergency room where they had an acute myocardial infarction and also suffered from wackadoodleosis, something like that, where you make up cucumycin, these words. The LLM actually incorporates that into a body of work where it kind of feels connected. So that's another way that it gets kind of discombobulated. So there are a lot of issues here. In the final analysis, though, I think that large language models are extraordinarily powerful tools. But we have to remember that they are tools. And they are getting closer and closer and closer to human thinking. And that kind of sounds like it's in contrast to what I said earlier, that they don't think, that they're antithetical, that they're anti-intelligence. What they're doing is they're getting closer and closer and closer to human thought by making the models a closer and closer facsimile to human thinking. In other words, it becomes asymptotic. If you remember that word in math, where a curve gets closer and closer and closer and closer to a point, but never crosses the point. If I said to you, I'm standing 10 feet away from a wall, and every minute I get half close. So 10 feet becomes 5 feet, becomes 2.5 feet, becomes 1.25 feet. How long would it take me to get to the wall? The answer is never, never, because I'm always having the distance. So large language models are becoming better and better and better simulators. And that leads us to a very interesting question. Who cares? Because if it's that close, then maybe from a functional perspective, it doesn't matter. And that's philosophical more than technological. But one other point here is, in organic chemistry, we make this stuff called amyl acetate. And amyl acetate has a curious feature that it tastes exactly like bananas. So the question is, if I gave you this spoonful of amyl acetate and it tastes exactly like a banana, are you experiencing a banana? Well, in the final analysis, you may think it is, and it may function as a model that is appropriate, that in the real world might work, but the reality is it's not. It's not a banana. It's a fake banana. It's a substitute for banana that gets infinitesimally close. And that's why I think that anti-intelligence, the idea of being antithetical, is relevant here. That as close as AI gets to human thinking, it's still extraordinarily complex statistical processing in a hyperdimensional space. It doesn't become thinkers. And so that's why I think it's still quite an issue.
Yeah, so I've heard people say this as well, that AI could be replacing certain thinking skills, right?
Mhm.
What do you think is the best way to get those skills back, if at all?
Well, boy, that's so. Remember the introduction of the calculator. You may not
Mhm.
be old enough to remember that, but they said, "Oh, don't take that calculator into your math class." I think it might have been in the 70s or the 80s, right? They were prohibited because what was going to happen? They were going to make you lose your math skills. And of course, that was not the case. I think that, yes, there is a concern that if we defer thinking to a machine, what happens to us humans? But that's only part of the equation. That's the Hollywood dystopian version of AI. But when we look at the real world version of innovation and technology, we find something that's quite the opposite, albeit for the first time we're talking about human cognition. And remember, human cognition is now on the obsolescence chopping block. So that changes that argument a little bit. But we found that, for example, Civil War photography in America did not end portraiture. It did not end painting. Photography didn't squash that creativity. In fact, it expanded it. And that's a very, very interesting perspective. In fact, many years later, the birth of another billion-dollar industry called the selfie emerged from that. And the point I'm making here is that innovation does not cut the pie into smaller pieces or subordinate us or subordinate our thinking. It makes the circle of innovation, of accomplishment, of achievement, of human experience broader. It makes it bigger. When Boris Spassky lost the famous chess game to IBM's Deep Blue, did that end chess? No, chess today, even in the context of AI, super accomplished AI, has never been more popular. So I think that will it squash human thinking because it does all the thinking? Or will it expand the circle of innovation to a bigger circle where human capacity is engaged in new and exciting ways? And that's where I think the promise of AI is. It's not that it just subordinates human thought so we don't think. It's going to open up new channels of expanded thinking and cognitive partnership. That's extraordinarily exciting to me.
Yeah, it's definitely changing the way we think, right? And the way we create, the way we even connect. What's one mindset shift you think we all need to make about AI over the next 5 years?
I think that we need to understand it as being wonderfully different. And I know
Mm.
that is a contradiction in terms, but I do believe that artificial intelligence is not human-like. It is not sentient. It does not have a consciousness as many people tend to believe. But what it does, it creates wonderful, beautiful linguistic theater. And that theater, that linguistic theater is so well orchestrated that it's hard for us to believe that it's coming from one of those thinking machines. So we have to be a little skeptical. We have to understand that it is a different form of intelligence, anti-intelligence, if you want to go back to the beginning of our discussion. But it also is probably the single transformation in human history. And you touched on the idea of fire very early on. I often argue that fire was our first technology because it let us move, migrate, stay up late, change the very nature of civilization. Also allowed us to cook food and eat protein, which grew our brains. Yet it also was used as a weapon, as something that we could use against our neighbors and our enemies. So interestingly, fire has emerged as both one of the greatest innovations, but also the greatest weapon. And as we move through history, even today, fire still remains not only integral to our success, to our industrial capacity, to our heating our homes or heating water to take a shower. It's also the single biggest source of property destruction in the world today. So have we mitigated the risk? No, we put the risk into some level of perspective. And what we've learned is that we see this. The first airplane in 1917 was the coolest thing in the world, but I wasn't getting on it. And even today, we live with risks. Many, many people are afraid to fly, even though flying is the safest form of transportation in the world. So the bigger the innovation, the bigger the fear. And I don't think we've ever been at a point where the innovation is any bigger than artificial intelligence. And correspondingly, I think there's going to be a fear. That's a good thing, but we have to put that fear into perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of touch on linguistic theater that you mentioned. Could you maybe break that down a little bit more for
Sure.
our listeners?
Let me try to answer that question like an LLM. Pursuant to the matter at hand, the linguistic dynamics often yield an interesting consequence that aligns with cognitive capacity in humans to optimize flow. Okay, there it is. I don't know what the hell I just said.
Are you sure you're not AI?
Maybe. Um, but what just happened there was I put together a string of words that fit, that had a certain feeling to it that, wow, I mean, you almost can't refute what I said because it sounds so darn smart. That's what I mean about linguistic theater. Large language models are experts at coherence. Think about that word. They know what word sits next to another word that sits next to another word, and they craft something that is extraordinarily well written. Is it right? I don't know. Does it sound right? Absolutely. So when I talk about linguistic theater, we see this all the time on social media where people go into their large language models and romance them. In other words, they cognitively flirt with him. They talk about God. They talk about transcendence. They talk about nuclear physics and subatomic particle theory. And what they do is they get the LLM into this sort of self-reinforcing spiral of coherence built upon bullshit. And so what these people post is words and the concepts that they don't even understand. The stuff that I just said. They talk about, reciprocal back bonding with ligands of osmium and how this relates to van der Waal reactions. I mean, it's just pulled together in a way that is very, very sexy. That's what cognitive theater is. That's what large language models do. They build a paragraph, they build a sequence of words that fit together very, very smoothly and often carry the panache of sophistication, yet they often aren't sophisticated at all. They're tricks. And I see this time and time again, particularly in areas where we have a low skill set. So when these large language models start talking about God and
Mhm.
quantum mechanics, we can't respond to it because we don't understand the intricacies of quantum mechanics. We saw this many years ago. We saw that Eastern spirituality, particularly Buddhism, was aligned with quantum mechanics in a book called Dancing Woolly Masters by Gary Zukov. And he made very interesting comparisons between physics concepts and Buddhist concepts like impermanence and things like that, synchronicity. And what they weren't scientific thoughts, they weren't theories, they were accidents of language that he brought to life very eloquently. So I think that's what we're seeing when we talk about this sort of linguistic theater. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but it's curiously dangerous.
Yeah, I see a lot of especially on social media, right? Like you can tell when someone's post was written by AI. Do you think we're already relying on AI too much in our daily lives?
Maybe we're not relying on AI enough. I don't know if we're relying on AI too much.
Hmm.
The fundamental insight that I see, and I hope this reflects to all our listeners, is that AI has made me smarter. AI has not dulled my cognition in any way, shape, or form. It's made me a better writer. In fact, I think I write very well now because I'm challenged by AI. I've always liked the dash, the M dash, but now the M dash is a trigger for people that says, "Oh, that was written by an LLM." So I don't think so. I think that LLMs have made me smarter because I recognize the nature of the engagement.
That's really interesting, but I suppose it's um, it's your approach and it's how you see AI, right? And how you use AI. So, what's your personal golden rule for using AI wisely?
Wow. That's tough. I think using AI wisely is understanding that it is a statistical tool that builds connections and that it's up to me to analyze, interrogate, question, push back on. I am the thinker here, and yet we often defer our thinking to a large language model. I think that you know, I'm not going to say it's dangerous because we defer a lot of activities. We've deferred the washing of clothes to a washing machine. We've deferred horseback riding between two cities as part of government to taking a helicopter or driving a car. So deferring is not necessarily the problem. And I think making those hard and fast rules aren't going to work. I think we have to recognize that our thinking is stimulated and supported by a large language model. Don't give up. Don't have an LLM write that darn email for you. Use your brain because these technologies now are in essence tools of cognitive enhancement that make us smarter. Originally, I talked about lifelong learners, but that intellectual engagement also has relationships to things like getting older. We know that if you maintain a certain level of cognitive activity, that it can help with dementia and cognitive disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. The data is a little bit ambiguous on that, but the ability to think and work with a tool is the gym. It's the cognitive gym. And one other thing, we don't all have access to a mentor. We don't all have access to a great teacher. In fact, some of us, a lot of older people around the world don't have access to someone to chat with. And in that context, large language models can be very powerful tools. Can they be disruptive? Can they be insidious? Of course, but we just can't think about the negative. We have to think about what happens if there's nothing there at all. So to me, large language models are very powerful tools, and it's really up to us to be the guiding influence.
Yeah, I think, when AI first came to the scene a couple of years ago, one of the things that I was saying is that it's actually helping us to ask better questions. And so before we wrap things up, John, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Leanna. Voltaire, the French philosopher, said something. He said, "You don't judge a person by their answers. You judge a person by their questions." And that is so foundational. And it's that question and it's that iterative dialogue that is very, very important and very, very powerful. And I'll just summarize it this way and we can wrap it up. The nature of this iterative dialogue, right? Unlike Google, which is transactional, tell me the weight of the planet Mars. With large language models, we can iterate. We can have that dialogue that goes back and forth. And as important and as powerful as this is, it's not new. It's not new. It's the Socratic dialogue. It's kids sitting around a campfire chatting. It's doctors walking down the hallway during rounds, conversing and having a discussion about a patient. That's where we are with large language models. And recognizing that they're not perfect, but in many instances, they provide a very, very interesting perspective for our edification and our use. So that's what I think is important.
And that's it for today's conversation on anti-intelligence. John, thank you so much for sharing your insights and challenging the way we think about AI.
My pleasure.
I'm Lianna Adams, and I hope this episode sparked some fresh thoughts about how we work with and sometimes against the machines we've built. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.